The Millennia Stories by Brian Aldiss. An Hegelian Perspective, A Journey to the Interior. The Mutant Millennia, which was originally called Gene Hive, but its first title, when it was published in 1958, was Journey into the Interior. Humankind is on its last gasp, and a new breed is on the way. Evolution, it can be instantaneous and triggered, as a female healer triggers spontaneous evolution in an injured man. Genes build themselves into cells and cells into the gene hive called man in order to develop their potentialities, not man's. The idea of man's being able to develop was purely an anthropomorphic concept. Now I give that quote from the story now because it shows that this tale presents a scientific approach to the theme of gene shifting and genetic engineering, which anticipates a central idea of Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, 1976, by nearly 2 decades. We can now see that the organism and the group of organisms are true rivals for the vehicle role in the story, but neither of them is even a candidate for the replicator role. The controversy between individual selection and group selection is a real controversy between alternative vehicles. As it happens, the outcome, in my view, is a decisive victory for the individual organism. The group is too wishy-washy an entity. I suppose wishy-washy must be a technical term of his. So the story. As the years passed and Yinisfar, that's Earth, conquered by commerce, its attitudes insensibly underwent modification. Then came the blow that forced man to alter his attitude towards himself. His metaphysical view of being had of course been continually subject to change, but now the terrible moment arrived when he was revealed to himself in an entirely new light as an alien in a hostile environment. It is useful that this next fragment reminds us, incidentally, that if the universe appeared to rest in human hands, humanity was never alone or unregarded. There was always things that could see, though they had no faces, and understand, though they had no brains. So, the undersea trawler Bartolomeo approaches the subport of Cape Verde at 490 fathoms, develops engine trouble, uranium slugs, I've no idea what they are, but let's run with the story, are moving slowly through the piles of the ship, and the dispensing mechanism that shoots the used slugs into the separators has become jammed, and instead of using a manual remote control to tackle the fault, the chief engineer, Gerard, whether there's any significance in that name, I don't know, went in himself to clear the slugway, but snags his protective suit on a latch without noticing it, repairs the congestion in the slugway, but collapses as he emerges, having collected a near-lethal dose of radiation in his kidneys. So a doctor is sent for. I have said, this is the narrator talking now, I have said I am no technician, neither am I a philosopher, yet I can see in this trivial episode, which began so many centuries of trouble, the pattern of all great changes, which start with something fairly insignificant. Dr. Cyril Gyres of the Barber, the Institute of Medical Meditation, is summoned. Gavin Gyres, industrial ecologist, is ready to meet his wife, who has just finished the month-long annual meditation retreat that is necessary for her registration as a doctor. Gavin explains to his wife Pamela's story. Pamela, I presume, is some scientist of the time, or some philosopher or something, or the Richard Dawkins of the time, I suppose. Palmyra's theory of power evolution, whereby he accepts the plateau, that's obviously Plato, it's not very subtle really, the plateau position of the dual theory, and claims that evolution is working toward greater consciousness. Plants are less conscious than animals, animals less conscious than men. Men came after the animals, which came after the plants. Plants, animals, men are only first steps in a long ladder. This includes women as well, by the way. This is just how the story is written, as is usual. But obviously, to be inclusive, I mean men and women. Man and woman is by not yet fully conscious. He and she sleeps, forgets, is unaware of the workings of his or her body, which is why doctors like Cyril exist. Only certain unusual individuals associated together into the orders of medicine can to some extent participate consciously in somatic activity. Palmyra postulates that the next evolutionary step would be a being conscious in every cell, and that nature may be already preparing to usher it onto the stage, for the time is ripe for the new being. Palmyra explained why the new species is due, for evolution accelerates like scientific progress. The more protoplasm available for modification, the sooner the modification appears. And on 30,000 planets, there is quite a weight of protoplasm. Whatever this superconscious new species might be, says Cyril, humanity would give it a little chance to establish its supremacy or even to survive. It would be blotted out before it had the chance to multiply. After all, we could hardly be expected to be hospitable to the usurpers of our comfortable place in the cosmos. Gowand, again I don't really know whether there's any significance in that name, tells her that according to Palmyra, evolution would take care of that if it really wanted. Humans out of the way, the new species would be given some sort of defense or weapon to render it invulnerable against the species it would be superseding. But Cyril protests. Evolution is a completely neutral, blind process. And that was exactly Palmyra's concern, Gowand explained. Eventually, Sarah Giles enters the cell of the sick man and lies next to him. She takes the plunge into the somatic world of her own bodily universe, passes the lobe of consciousness, her psyche, into Girard's arm, into his soma, making her way to his infected kidneys. Things like little bats, turtle chittering out of the heart of the darkness, were struck down, were devoured, and then the enemy launched his assault. He struck with the suddenness of a closing trap. He was one, he was a million, he was nothing the textbook know of, unknown, unknowable. He fought with laws and powers entirely his own. He was monstrous, bestial, occult, agreed with fangs, a horned horror, newly hatched, a random radioactive particle, had struck down and buried itself into the random gene, producing with the ferocious defense of the laws of chance a freak cell, a mutant cell, with unfamiliar appetites. Nothing in her training prepared her to understand what the appetites were. So a nuclear accident has triggered a change in the man's body, making one of the cells sentient. A bit like X-Men here, or superheroes like the Incredible Hulk, who are changed by mutation due to being exposed to radiation. Well, that's not the X-Men, no, it's the Hulk and the Fantastic Four. Although they were exposed to cosmic rays, weren't they? Anyway, that's beside the by. The rogue cell, and this was written before all those comics, the rogue cell rendered other cells sentient and transformed the man into a shapeshifter, the next stage in the evolution of life. The man absorbs Syro, then other people, and upon unaffected humans approaching him with atomic weapons, he merges with a mass migration of butterflies and disappears. That's how the story ends. Which first appeared in this magazine here. That's not exactly a brilliant illustration, but I thought I would show it because of the significance of this being where Aldiss's story first appeared. No, I think I could have done a better illustration than that. Anyway, moving on. So where does Hegel fit into all this? Well, this is really interesting, you know. Let's first see what Hegel thought of evolution, because his philosophical system is in fact evolutionary, but he did not accept biological evolution. In fact, I have this quote here from the Philosophy of Nature. He calls it the inept conception, in which the progression and transition of one natural form and sphere into a higher is regarded as an outwardly actual production, somewhat clarified by being relegated into the murkiness of the past, may be found in both ancient and modern philosophies of nature. It is precisely the externality which allows differences to fall apart and appear as indifferent existence, which is characteristic of nature. It is the dialectical notion which is the inner principle of the same and guides its stages forward. Thinking consideration must reject such nebulous and basically sensuous conceptions as, for example, the so-called emergence of plants and animals out of water, and of the more highly developed animal organizations out of the lower, etc. The production of living being is generally envisaged as this is actually towards the end of the Philosophy of Nature now. The production of living being is generally envisaged as a revolution out of chaos, in which vegetable and animal life, organic and inorganic being, were together in a single unity. The alternative postulate is that there was once a general living existence, which has dispersed into various species of plants and animals, and into the races of mankind. Such prodigies are the postulates of the sensuous intuition of an empty imagination. However, for it is not permissible to assume the sensuous appearance of this fission in time, or the temporal existence of such a general man. Natural and living being is not mixed. It is not a general medley of forms. It does not resemble an arabesque. There is essentially understanding in nature. The formations of nature are determinate and bounded, and it is as such that they enter into existence. Consequently, even if the earth was once devoid of living being and limited to the chemical process, etc., as soon as the flash of living being strikes into matter, a determinate and complete formation is present and emerges fully armed, like Minerva from the brow of Jupiter. The account of the creation given in Genesis is still the best, insofar as it says quite simply that the plants, the animals, and man were brought forth on separate days. Man has not formed himself out of the animal, nor the animal out of the plant, for each is instantly the whole of what it is. Such an individual certainly evolves in various ways, but although it is not yet complete at birth, it is already the real possibility of everything it will become. Living being is the point at which the soul is present. It is subjectivity and infinite form, and is therefore immediately determined in and for itself. The crystal already exhibits complete shape and totality of form as point, so that the point's ability to grow is merely a quantitative change. This is even more the case with living beings. Now, Hegel, in the Phenomenology of Spirit, explores the way in which human consciousness develops through history, but in the Philosophy of Nature, his interest was in the logical connection between stages in nature, and hence there was a lack of concern with trying to explain how it is that natural phenomena emerge in time. It is up to natural science to elucidate the natural history of the universe, or on the origin of life. Hegel rejected the doctrine of evolution of species. He died 28 years before Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Although he would have known about the evolutionary theory of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, whereby lower organisms are generated spontaneously and higher organisms gradually develop from them through the transmission of acquired characteristics, and he believed that species emerged fully formed, Lamarck believed, that species emerged fully formed and No, Hegel believed that species emerged fully formed and fixed. Yes, I'm getting mixed up here. Anyway, this will all prove to be irrelevant anyway. But Hegel's philosophical concern, as I said, is with the logical rather than temporal relations between phenomena in nature, and to understand not the historical process whereby phenomena in nature have come to be the way they are, but the logic that requires nature to have the structures that it now has. So, the history of the Earth in the philosophy of nature. As this terrestrial organism has being merely as an implicitness, its members do not contain the living process within themselves, but constitute an external system. The forms of this system exhibit the unfolding of an underlying idea, but its process of formation belongs to the past. The powers of this process, which nature leaves behind as independent and extraterrestrial, are the connection and position of the Earth within the solar system, its solar, lunar and cometary life, and the inclination of its axis to the orbit, and the magnetic axis. Standing in closer relationship to these axes and their polarization are the distribution of sea and land, the connected diffusion of land in the northern hemisphere, the division and tapering off of the land masses towards the south, the additional separation into an old and a new world, the further division of the old world into the various continents. These continents are distinguished from one another by the physical, organic and anthropological characteristics which distinguish them once again from the younger and less mature characteristics of the New World. Mountain ranges, etc., may also be considered here. The history of the Earth is therefore purely empirical and partly a conclusive ratiocination from empirical data. The point of interest is not to determine the conditions prevailing millions of years ago, and there's no need to stint on the years, that's an important point, but to concentrate upon that which is present in the system of these various formations. As an empirical science, it is extremely diffuse. One is unable to grasp everything in this corpse by means of the notion, for it is riddled with accidents. Philosophy has a similarly minimal interest in equating itself with the rational and systematic. Legislation in the dismal condition of chaos, or in getting to know the temporal sequence and external causes by which the legislation has come into being. So Hegel was committed to a synchronic rather than diachronic understanding of nature and life. Hence he would have had no more interest in the Darwinian theory of evolution than in the Lamarckian theory. Of philosophical interest are the logical relations between natural phenomena, such as is exemplified in the science of comparative anatomy, founded by naturalist and zoologist Georges Cuvier, that studies the similarities and differences in the anatomy of different species. Unlike evolutionary theory, Cuvier's science works towards the kind of systematic comprehension of nature as we find in speculative philosophy, since it provides the empirical information that enables thought to discern rational structural distinctions between animal species that exist now. A systematic philosophical interest in rational distinctions between animal species and in comparative anatomy is in no need of an abandonment of Darwinian or any other evolutionary theory. It is indeed compatible with the notion of species evolving from one another. And further, Hegel recognized that contingency has a necessary place in nature, just as chance, whatever that means, has its role to play, if I may put it that way, in Darwinian evolution. According to Darwinism, accidental or random, whatever that means. That word random is just used. What does it mean exactly, random? Does it mean without cause, or what? Mutations occur in organisms due to errors in DNA replication that enable them to adapt to a changing environment better than other organisms, and the organisms with advantageous mutations then survive and reproduce more successfully than others, leading to the emergence of new varieties and eventually new species. The emergence of higher forms of life, including human beings, is to a considerable degree, and perhaps totally, a matter of chance, and Hegel grants contingency a significant role in nature. So there is a rational tendency toward life and consciousness in nature, and yet where and when they will emerge depends upon circumstances that from a philosophical point of view are contingent. Contingency plays a role in determining the different animal species that exist on Earth. It is a requirement of reason that life take the form not just of plant life but also of animal life, because only animal life is truly organic. There are rational structural differences between different kinds of animal, for instance insects, fish, birds and mammals. The element in or over which the animal moves, be it water, air or land, as well as the local geography, determines together the character of different animal species. Animals are always suited to a specific environment. So to quote from the philosophy of nature again, in nature it is the external conditions which stunt the forms of living being, but these conditions produce these effects because life is indeterminate, and also because it is from these externalities that it derives its particular determinations. The forms of nature cannot be brought into an absolute system, therefore, and it is because of that the animal species are exposed to contingency. Hence we have the myriad of transitional forms that we discover in the animal world, whether the flying or swimming animals, and those that do not, and so on. It is reason, geography and contingency that operate together to create the species that populate the Earth. So, Aldiss was a writer of speculative fiction in the sense of fantastical and imaginative. Speculative fiction is sometimes another term for science fiction. I suppose speculative fiction is probably better. And speculative fiction, he was also a writer of speculative fiction in the sense of speculative philosophy. It does not matter whether Gene Hive makes any sense with regard to the reality of how biological evolution actually works, according to past or present scientific evolutionary theory. Criticizing Aldiss's work for its wild, far-fetched or even nonsense science, as we've done with Hothouse, excellent novel, but its science was much criticized at the time as being not just impossible. But anyway, that's beside the by. Criticizing it for nonsense science is missing the point. His work is to be read and understood within a speculative philosophical point of view. What matters is the philosophical account of the logical relations between natural phenomena, between ourselves and natural processes. What is life? What are we? So let us dig into it. If you can turn Fanta. Eternity awaits. What is life? So, the philosophy of spirit, where he explains what life is. But for us, or in itself, the object, which for self-consciousness is a negative element, has on its side returned into itself, just as on the other side consciousness has done. Through this reflection into itself, the object has become life. What self-consciousness distinguishes from itself as having being also has in it, insofar as it is posited as being, not merely the character of sense certainty and perception, but it is being that is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is a living thing, for the in itself, or the universal result of the relation of the understanding to the inwardness of things, is the distinguishing of what is not to be distinguished, or the unity of what is distinguished. So in the phenomenology, consciousness, you see, he brings in life when he makes the move from consciousness to self-consciousness. Consciousness had engaged with objects of various kinds, not in themselves endowed with life, and thus bereft of the dynamism and capacity for self-transcendence to adapt to varying circumstances. Self-consciousness, on the other hand, is identified with the determination of life, and this introduces some fundamental distinctions in the science of consciousness. Self-consciousness is desire, as Hegel says elsewhere. Desire is principally oriented towards life. Life initially is viewed as an object of self-consciousness, almost as though it were exterior to itself, albeit self-consciousness implicitly understands itself as life and endeavours to apprehend other life in this process. The object is for us, or in itself, two sides of the same coin, or has been seen demonstrated in these sections on perception and understanding in the phenomenology. Now we observe it demonstrated in terms of living things, as the object which for self-consciousness is the negative element has on its side returned into itself or reflected into itself. We discover a conceptual division generating a polarity, an opposition, two sides producing reflection into itself, a journey into the interior, which was the original title of Gene Hive, for there is something not immediately apparent upon the surface. Self-consciousness is distinguished. That journey from the interior isn't a quote from Hegel, by the way. I just put it in there because Hegel is talking about interiority now. So he is in effect journeying into the interior. I'm just making connections, you see. A journey into the interior, for there is something not immediately apparent upon the surface. Self-consciousness is distinguished by the fact that it is a relation to itself and relation to other things. Self-consciousness in its relation to other things is in addition taken up into its relation to itself, and on both sides there was a reflection into itself without precisely the same processing occurring. A reflection into itself on both sides, which does not mean that it is precisely the same process that has taken place, and through this reflection into itself the object has become life. It is not a process of reiteration or precipitation or reiteration. Put aside for a moment human beings or other animals, and think of plants and fungi and other kinds that have little going on so far as perception or locomotion is concerned. They perceive and respond to their environment in a certain kind of way, a responsiveness to what is not, and also what is not it, and also a direction of itself from within itself. Living things have a kind of interiority that non-livings do not. A living thing has a dynamic reflection into itself qua object, and it distinguishes from itself as an object, as having being, as having a kind of substantiality and otherness to itself, and a distinguishing from itself, and this is interiority, this relation to itself being that is reflected into itself, and the object of immediate desire is a living thing. It is something that has life or is life, something that is going to differentiate itself into an infinity of differences. A living thing, the in itself, or the universal result of the relation of the understanding to the inwardness of things. Recall the inverted world laws and forces, which were covered in the understanding section of the phenomenology, where the understanding is desperately endeavouring to figure out what is actually going on behind the mirror appearances. And now we see that it has to do with living things in a way. The living thing is a better representative of what we find occurring throughout the Hegelian system. unity involving a repulsion from itself, a splitting of itself into two moments, self-othering and self-repelling. Life exhibits this much more directly than do non-living things or non-living systems, a distinguishing of what is not to be distinguished or the unity of what is distinguished, but a unity that is just as much its repulsion from itself. So, this is very beautifully and vividly what the process, this kind of process is very beautifully and vividly described and characterized in the mutant millennia, where as Syro submerges into her own interiority and that of the sick man, this is a unity, while life is an exterior object for her, self-consciousness. So we have this vivid description of the kind of processes at work here. So I quote from the novel now. She was sinking down through a dull red haze, a featureless haze, a haze stretching from pole to pole, but gradually a mirage forming in the distance. Striations appeared through the haze. As her viewpoint sunk, it magnified. The islands of the blood slid up to meet her. The islands moved for the clerical purpose of vultures, expanding, changing, ranging, rearranging. Still she moved among them. Though she moved, all sense of direction was entirely shed. Here the dimensions carried no sense of up or down. Even near or far were confused to her sight, which was no longer sight. Not only sight had she lost, almost every other ability, except volition, had been stripped from her when she took this plunge into the somatic world of her own bodily universe. As a man throws off all his clothes before diving into a river, she could not think, remember, taste, touch, turn, communicate, or act, yet a shadow of all these things remained with her. Almost without will, she headed down her bloodstream. It was swimming, flying, crawling through an endless everglade, flooded above the treetops, treacle thick with fish, minnow, mackerel, mace, and manta ray. Maybe that should be mace. It was creeping, climbing, drifting down a glass canyon whose walls flickered with more than earthly firelight. So, until before her loomed a wavering cliff. The cliff ran around the universe, tall as time, insubstantial as muslin, pockmarked with rabbit holes, through which phantasmic creatures came and went. She drifted through it almost without resistance, like plankton sucked through a sponge. I like that. Back to the phenomenology. It'll all come together soon. The determination of life, as it has issued from the notion, or the general result with which we enter this sphere, is sufficient to characterize it without having further to develop its nature. Its sphere is completely determined in the following moments. Essence is infinity, as the supersession of all distinctions, the pure movement of axial rotation, its self-repose being an absolutely restless infinity, independence itself, in which the differences of the movement are resolved, the simple essence of time, which in this equality with itself has a stable shape of space. The differences, however, are just as much present as differences in this simple universal medium, for this universal flux has its negative nature only in being the supersession of them, but it cannot supersede the different moments if they do not have an enduring existence. It is the very flux as the self-identical independence, which is itself an enduring existence, in which therefore they are present as distinct members and parts existing on their own account. Being no longer has the significance of abstract being, nor has their pure essentiality the significance of abstract universality. On the contrary, their being is precisely that simple, fluid substance of pure movement within itself. The difference, however, qua difference of these members with respect to one another, consists in general in no other determinateness than that of the moments of infinity or the pure movement itself. Living things have an interiority. With self-consciousness, then, we have therefore entered the native realm of truth. That's from the phenomenology. A dynamic reflection into itself. Self-consciousness is hunger for life. Curiosity is a desire to be in an environment. Life differentiates itself into an infinity of differences, and self-consciousness grasps the unity of the differences. Hence how difficult it is to take all of life in the profusion that comes with the world of living things. We've had that kind of thing described in the passage that I read from the Mutant Millennia. The nature of life is then developed further by Hegel, something for which self-consciousness is moved by in immediate desire. Its essence is infinity. There is no final point to it. Essence is the supersession of all differences. In the condition which we found in that journey to the interior in the story, the supersession of all differences. In the condition of being rolled into something greater, a greater unity, things are totally disconnected. All these differentiated moments, existing members, enduring existence, and they really are differences because they are in a particular medium. A metaphor for this pure movement is that of actual rotation, a perfect emblem for something changing in process while remaining still, a changing of position to everything, a changing of orientation in the same place, a restless infinity, and an independent relation of what it is in its changingness. A succession of states. Now we are concerned with time. It is time we are dealing with, spatialized time. Here we are. Things like little bats hurtle chittering out of the heart of darkness, were struck down, were devoured. Then the enemy launched his assault. He struck with the suddenness of a closing trap. It was one. He was a million, the supersession of all differences. It was nothing the textbooks know of, unknown, unknowable. He fought with laws and powers entirely his own. Here were the laws behind appearances. That's back to the understanding. He was monstrous, bestial, occult, agreed with fangs. This is desire. A horned horror, newly hatched. He was so overwhelming that Saru hardly felt fear. The presence of the unknown can kill everything but calm in us. She was aware only that a random radioactive particle had struck down and buried itself in a random gene, producing, with a ferocious defiance of the laws of chance, a freak cell, a mutant cell with unfamiliar appetites. Nothing in her training prepared her to understand what the appetites were. Those appetites had lain dormant until she approached. She had triggered them, woken them, she had breathed her touch of conscience onto them, and at once the cell had filled with its own awareness, and its awareness was of the desire to conquer. She could see, feel, hear, sense that it was tearing through cell after cell, a maniac through empty rooms, filling them with its rebellion. The healing forces about her turned and filled with panic, winging and swinging against a wind which held them helpless. Sairo, too, turned to escape. Her own body was her only refuge, if she could get there. But the nailed streamers came out of the darkness and wrapped themselves about her. She cracked open her jaws to their toothed extremes, struggling to scream. At once her mouth was filled with spawns from which little creatures flung themselves and scampered wildly through her being, triumphing. Right, I was going to cover this all in one video, but I've got such a lot to cover that I will make it into 2 videos. to be continued on this cliffhanger. Although I've already told you how the story ends, but anyway. Essence is infinity, as the supersession of all distinctions, the pure movement of axial rotation. I like that.